No.
Okay.
So we could resume the hearing session. So we've got a question on the S12 site, so the Beddington Resource Recovery Facility, and this is one from Mr. Furness in terms of the progress with the Section 106 agreement. I take it that the sign off with that was imminent. Have you got anything further to add on that?
Yeah, the final draft of the Section 106 agreement was returned to the GLA last Friday, and we are hoping to have the document signed in September, and so the permission would follow thereafter.
Okay, then moving on now to matter 361. So this is the plan's restrictive approach to new development for waste users, justified and consistent with the London plan. So I'd like to stay with you on this point, please, Mr. Furness, for your views on that particular matter.
Yeah, I think this follows on really from the discussion that we had yesterday, where I agree with the assessment, obviously, that has been discussed this morning, that there's no need to safeguard further land. In fact, obviously, there's discussions this morning have led more in to the realm of release of some further sites. But the way that the industry is progressing at the moment, with the Environment Bill, extended producer responsibility, consistent collections, varying different pieces of legislation which are still going through their life and yet to be adopted, I think it would be difficult to suggest that you can forecast exactly where the market will be in 10 years' time, much like 10 years ago when most of our portfolio was landfill sites. It would have been difficult to forecast where we are today. So I think while I understand the approach to not allocate specific sites, to not safeguard land, I think it is restrictive in view of the policies within National Plan and Policy for Waste and the London Plan to suggest that new waste development, full stop, would not have a home in South London. To provide an example of something which at the moment we're working on a large reuse facility in Manchester for our Manchester contract. That facility takes in materials that have been discarded at household waste recycling centres, so furniture, toys, bikes. They are all still classed as waste at the point of delivery to that site. They're repaired at the site, collected then by different charities or sold on to householders. And that requires a very large shed, industrial shed. It's a very new facility. It hasn't been rolled out in many other places across the UK, but we are starting to see those facilities rolled out across the UK as part of the circular economy. So that would come forward in my mind as a waste application, given that the materials delivered, strictly speaking, would still be waste, but there would be no home for that in South London as a policy position. And I know material considerations indicate otherwise, but as an initial point, in a plan-led system, I would just question whether or not it's the right approach to take. It's not something that I've seen really well, arguably in any other sector of the economy, that somebody would say something which is typically on an industrial estate that one use would be withheld because there's enough. It's led by the market usually, and so I would just request a slight loosening of the word in there that again followed the policy that we discussed yesterday, which is if there's evidence that you're driving materials up the hierarchy, et cetera, that there could be some exceptions.
Any initial responses to those points, Mr. James?
I think probably obviously the council's position is well known by everybody involved, and what our principal arguments are. I certainly won't bore you by going through all those in detail again, but obviously the highlight is that we've got enough capacity to meet apportioned waste to exceed it, in fact, which already includes some of London's waste. So it's 13% above the risings. So given that we're already significantly contributing, and the fact that we have this severe need for industrial land, which we've obviously talked about at length already, that we think it is justified to put a slight restriction on new waste sites, unless it's for compensatory provision, which we discussed yesterday. Obviously, other waste plan areas are in a different position to us. Obviously, some have capacity caps. We don't think that we do, which is why we think we're justified to then give more weight to our need to provide enough industrial land. If there are new waste sites coming forward that aren't for compensatory provision and not on existing sites, that's going to be land occupying what could be used for industrial purposes. We've flagged up in our statements the GLA's evidence base that it used to inform the London plan. Sutton was one of only 3 boroughs in London that was recommended to provide more industrial capacity, the other 3 boroughs to retain, whereas a lot of other London boroughs were recommended that they had surplus industrial land that could be released. So I think there are greater opportunities for new waste sites to be located in other parts of London where there is a surplus for industrial land, as opposed to South London, where we're meeting apportionment, exceeding apportionment, and we've got a recognised need to meet that employment need. I mean, I take the point that Mr. Furness has made, and in the statements that, you know, waste uses and industrial uses to the general person look the same. They both create employment opportunities. Maybe they'll have similar impacts in terms of transport and on the highway. I wouldn't dispute that, but from a plan making perspective, and I used this example yesterday, when we're having to demonstrate that we can meet employment need or industrial need, we're not going to be able to take into account waste sites. That's been our experience in the past. They've been discounted from those calculations. So that ended up resulting in us releasing metropolitan open land to meet employment need when there were long-standing vacant waste sites, which we thought we could use, but we couldn't because they were safeguarded. So I think those are our main arguments, as I say, which are well known now, and we think that it's justified based upon those 2 points. I think the final thing I'll say is that obviously we continue to work with the GLA, and they haven't raised any further issues with this. They obviously issued their letter of conformity, so they, on that basis, consider that our approach is consistent with the London plan. That's the Mayor's position, that's the Mayor's opinion on this, and obviously we're in agreement with him on that point. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Potter, I can see your hands up.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, so stepping away from just our client's interest, I just want to confirm my agreement with Mr. Furness's view, particularly around these potential facilities that would be moving waste sort of further up the hierarchy than might normally be contemplated, even with regard to the apportionments. So, you know, in the reuse realm. And then we almost get into the realms that Mr. Normington were referring to yesterday around sort of circular economy type activities. And perhaps it comes back, I mean, there is an element about new sites, but also about this kind of safeguarding limitation that's set out in WP3 on the reference to only being sort of a potential limitation on that in clause A and clause C.
Thank you, Mr. Potter.
Can I just ask a question then of the council? And it's me playing devil's advocate. You're not going to like this again. But if the proposal came forward for an opportunity that might be in an industrial type shed that could minimise environmental harm and immunity harm in that sense, it was dealing with a facility like Mr. Furness raised, perhaps in Manchester, so absolutely bang in line with the circular economy, moving waste management up the hierarchy, and therefore, in terms of the objectives of the London plan, and to some extent the objectives of this plan, entirely consistent, but then it's that block of the policy. Where would that applicant go? In other words, is that what you really intend to say, that opportunities that come forward to move things up the waste hierarchy, entirely environmentally acceptable and sustainable, entirely consistent with circular economy, entirely consistent with the Mayor's environmental policies, entirely consistent with where the industry is going, this plan doesn't support it? Is that what you mean? Or tell me, against that background, where would an applicant who wanted to promote such a facility, where would they go in this plan to seek any support? Or is it just that we're not having any of that, mate? Thank you very much. Not in South London.
I mean, we do support those principles. So I think what we're saying is that, obviously, in our view, that should be facilitated through that could be delivered through compensatory provision, intensification of existing sites, as opposed to brand new waste sites, waste facilities occupying new land within our industrial estate. So we support waste moving up the hierarchy and the circular economy. It's just that the plan is proposing that that should be done, as I say, through compensatory provision or intensification of existing sites. And it comes back to the point, I mean, we have an issue with the design appearance of the waste facility. As I say, contest that they're very similar to other industrial uses. It's just when we're coming to the point of plan making, we in the past have treated them different and wouldn't include those as part of our employment, demonstrating that we can meet employment need. And that's our concern based upon our experience in the past. If we've got new sites coming in, that's less sites where we can demonstrate we could meet an industrial need on. And I think that's the sort of nub of our concern, as opposed to preventing sites moving up the waste hierarchy or promoting the circular economy.
So what might be the exceptional case if an applicant came forward and says, well, nobody wants to intensify their sites to do this. Nobody's got the market. I've got the contract. I've got the opportunity. I've got the site. I can do everything here. But what I can't do is anything because the policy is giving me a blanket no. But nonetheless, there isn't any other opportunity in the plan area to do this because nobody wants to take it on board. Nobody wants to intensify the site. And therefore, as a consequence, you are missing an opportunity. Is there any flexibility within the plan where such an argument could be made that could be directed and say, well, actually, there are exceptional circumstances here because those opportunities are just not coming forward, and therefore to tick other aspects of environmental strategy and meet other targets, recycling targets 2026, other things, there might be an argument need to be made. And what I'm perhaps looking at is, where is a plan flexible to be able to consider those matters while still having a matter of principle? Be careful with the use of the word principle, in terms of, look, we don't need it because we're looking really for intensification. But if it doesn't come forward through intensification, somebody promotes it on a new site, demonstrating that we can deliver this, we can do everything we want, how would the plan, other than being a outright no, which kind of environmentally can't be right, where does the plan go in terms of giving some flexibility for an exceptional case to be made, justified by evidence that demonstrates not there ain't any other opportunity, but you're missing opportunity if we don't do it?
I think we would have to concede that the plan, if it's a brand new site that's coming forward, so someone promoting a site that's not compensatory provision or intensification of an existing site, then the plan's position is, as you've outlined, would be no. So it would, if there was an applicant that wanted to make that case, it would have to be made at the planning application stage, with the introduction of obviously material considerations. But I think it's probably fair to say that there isn't anything expressly in the plan that would be able to direct an application of that type. Certainly not in the draft plan. I think it is probably the point you might be making, sir.
There's nothing in it. The question is, should there be?
I mean, our concerns are well known. You know, what we've got enough capacity. We've got industrial land needs. So one of the issues we considered was at what point do we say no? Because what we don't want, and this is something that's been flagged up by residents, by our members, we don't want to be, the capital of waste management in London. That I think that is a legitimate concern of people in our communities, given how much waste facilities we have, how much capacity we have, given that there's a recognised need for industrial land. So that's what's driving this position, sir. The GLA told us off effectively at the issues and options stage for having a phrase in there saying we don't want to be the waste dumping ground of London, which they didn't appreciate, which is gone now. But that's the concern of our local residents and communities, which is driving this. We've got enough waste. We've done our bit. We're exceeding apportionment, which already includes some of London's waste. So we felt that this was a justified position to take. Obviously these are arguments I've already made several times, so I won't repeat them again to you, sir.
Okay, I'm not going to probably push that any further, but kind of my interpretation of the position is, well, if something like that does come forward and it's not being delivered elsewhere, and nobody's shown interest in intensification, and contractually they might not be able to do that because that's just where the market's going, the position would be that the objective of moving waste up the hierarchy, fulfilling circular economy, pushing towards recycling targets, doesn't matter. We've shut up the borders. That's it. We've done. Don't need any more. Thank you. Go somewhere else. Is that the way I would interpret it? It's been kind of blunt, but it's to make a point and just to see what your reaction is. The point I'm really making is there any need for the exceptional argument within the plan to be made to give that flexibility so that the opportunity for London as a whole is not missed somewhere? And that's not me suggesting you water down anything in terms of the principles that you've set because of the issues that you've raised. But it's quite feasible in the future. There could be something that comes forward that just nobody has the ability to deal with. And there are other aspects of the planning to consider as well, and other aspects of the development plan to consider. But nonetheless, in terms of that opportunity for flexibility to deliver other targets in the London plan and development plan targets elsewhere, should the plan have any flexibility is my kind of question to you. And it's probably something you need to think about rather than me force you down this thinking on the hoof route. But I think you can probably see my argument, and you can see the argument made by Mr. Furness. And it's us thinking about whether or not, in terms of fulfilling those objectives, is actually the policies it's currently worded contrary to that? Is it counter to that? Because There might be opportunity that comes along the line here that's pushing everything in the right direction, and nobody else wants to take it on board, and it's not causing any other environmental or amenity harm, but nonetheless, as currently worded, you'd kind of push it away, which kind of doesn't quite seem right somehow. But I'll let you think about that. Your colleague wants to.
Just in the spirit of that thinking, and we've had these discussions before, and to some extent the question out loud it is, to what is this an exception, or it's a future, it's a growing market, and we're dealing with a plan dealing with the growth. The most of the applications coming through are skip operators, and that's the grind of this waste plan, the existing one, and this one to some extent is going to deal with. Hopefully that change that's being described is coming, and but at the moment, if you, in that scenario, if that comes forward and it's technically waste, and we are then giving permission to a waste facility, at the next 5-year revision of the plan and the AMR, we've got an existing waste site. That site gets safeguarded, and the way that the local plan making system is working, and the London plan, and the drive of those policies to safeguard existing waste sites, there is a creep. Now, I'm thinking out loud, there is probably caveats how you can kind of try and backstop that perverse result effectively from increase in safeguarding existing waste sites that have crept through this circular economy route. And then the next thing you see, hey, that was a good idea when that came in, but now it's been sold and now there's a different operator. So we need to think that through, is my final point.
I don't think any of us are kind of anti-circular economy, anti-progress, anti-alternatives to what we're currently doing. But it's just thinking about whether or not any flexibility exceptionally is required within the plan to ensure that the objectives can be met and not stifled perhaps by the current approach. And that's just something for you to think about, I think. It is really that argument. And Mr. Furness gave a good example that we can use to help our thoughts in developing that thinking as to, well, what would happen if that came forward? Would it be a straightforward no? But surely that's not right, because it's kind of contrary to everything we've said of what the aspirations of the plan are. So it's just something, I think it's something for you to have a think about in the context of the main modifications, and whether or not we're kind of tying ourselves a little bit in, tying our hand behind our back, really, making progress on what our clear aspirations are, unless there's some degree of flexibility built in that can deal with the exceptional case. I appreciate your point you're making. Where does this take us in the next 5 years and the next 5 years? And does it stack up our capacity issues? And I could say, well, that's fine enough. Deal with that when the next plan review comes around, because you'll have all the monitoring evidence. Of course you will. But I understand the point you're making. Absolutely understand the point you're making. But it does need some thought. But I can see both sides of the argument. But I think it's something that's been sensibly raised. And as I read the plan, and we touched upon it yesterday, you can see where it kind of takes you down the line so far, and then kind of puts a brick wall up. But then you read the other part of the plan, the start of the plan, it wants to go beyond the brick wall. So just have a think about how you deal with that kind of little bit of tension that comes through it.
Yeah, that's understood. So I think we can see the sort of direction of travel. So we'll put our heads together and have a think about that, how we can address that.
And just to add, I think we heard Mr. Furness talking about the plan-led system. So it's, whether that's effective in terms of what Inspector Normington's been talking about, and whether, deferring it to your section 38.6 balance of other material considerations at a planning application stage would, be a reasonable approach to that or not. So just to reflect on those points as well when you come to draw up a response. Anything further on that, Mr. Furness?
No, I don't think so. I just, like to make the point that I've made previously. This isn't to reflect anything that we have imminently in the pipeline, but in trying to make the point, really, it's the industry certainly, and my workload has been driven by almost very immediate requests from the business. It's not something that typically we've been able to feed into local plan timescales, and that is why the worry about this really does crop up, because if these do start being developed very quickly in the next 2-3 years to reflect the policy direction, we won't be able to wait for the next iteration of the plan to say this is the direction of travel. Please amend policy to reflect it. It will be we would like these to be X, Y, and Z locations, immediately. So I do appreciate the difficulties that the boroughs have raised with the way the plan has to be formulated and safeguarding sites then in the future. But it's just that tiny bit of flexibility that may or may not actually occur over the lifetime.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to move on to the policies on energy from waste. So on this one, I'll address this one to Mr. James. Could you explain the plan's approach to new energy from waste development, whether it is in general conformity with the London plan in these terms, and what the proposed modifications on these points seek to achieve?
I think our restriction on new energy from waste facilities, that approach arose as we sat in the statements from the Mayor's environmental strategy, where we felt it was made abundantly clear that there wouldn't be support for any future facilities, because the Mayor considered that there was sufficient capacity already from those types of facilities. So that was a reflection of the Mayor's approach in a separate strategy, which we've outlined in the matter statement. In terms of the modification, that was seeking to clarify the types of facility that wouldn't be supported as part of that policy approach within paragraph 5.45 as opposed to the actual policy itself. So really it was to reflect the Mayor's apparent lack of support for any future ERF facilities, as he considered that there were plenty already.
Okay, I take the point on the Mayor's environmental strategy, but in terms of what the London plan says in terms of this type of development, so that's policy SI 8D 2 and 4. If I can take you to that, please.
Sorry, so what was the specific reference? SI 8.
It's SI 8.
Just so I'm reading from the same page.
Yeah, D.
D.
So development proposals for materials and waste management sites are encouraged where they, so it's 3 and 4. Contribute towards renewable energy generation, especially renewable gas technologies from organic biomass waste and or are linked to low emission combined heat and power and or combined cooling, heat and power. And it refers to another London plan policy, but that seems to me to be more supportive than the environment strategy.
There may well be a sort of internal conflict between the mayor's documents there. I mean, it wasn't our intention to limit all of those things. We have already within the plan area heat networks which are linked into existing waste facilities that we have within the plan area. So it wasn't necessarily the intention of that policy or modification to limit those things. It was more to, as I say, to reflect the environmental strategy and the direction that the mayor had given there, which is why that was introduced there as well. Obviously, as well, the mayor, that's not something the mayor's raised objection with at any point in our discussions, as far as I can remember, and obviously considers the plan to be in general conformity with the waste plan.
Just pushing that a bit further, then you're not going to like me again. Environment Strategy 2018, London Plan adopted 2021. The South London Waste Plan refers to the Environment Strategy in terms of justification for that. Doesn't refer to the policy that we've just been looking at now in the London Plan. And it seems to me we've got another tension because I appreciate you're not here to resolve the tension between the Environment Strategy and the London Plan, but nonetheless we need to think about conformity with the London Plan. That's a planning document. And in terms of what that says, as I read it, it seems to be saying something entirely opposite to what you've got in the policy. So just for a moment, put the environmental strategy aside and let's focus what's in the London Plan. If I were to ask you as a professional planner, do you think the South London Waste Plan is in conformity with that aspect of that policy? How would you respond to me?
Yeah, I take your point. So obviously the environmental strategy, the London Plan is the adopted planning document, not the environment strategy. So we have to have regard to that, despite what the mayor may be saying elsewhere. And on that basis, obviously the waste plan is saying something different to what the London Plan policy says in that regard, irrespective of what the mayor may be saying in one of his other documents. So on that basis, it's I can't contest that it isn't consistent.
And I don't think we're trying to catch you out. I think it's us trying to just say, well, actually, we seem to have an area, despite the mayor's letter, of conformity. We do seem to have an issue here which doesn't quite seem right, that may be an oversight, or we've maybe focused on maybe the environment strategy too much and lost sight of what's going in the London Plan. But it does seem to us that we need something to be resolved here. We've got a fundamental tension. The policy in the South London Waste Plan is 180 degrees in the opposite direction to what the policy on the same matter is saying in the London Plan. So I think, again, it's probably one of those where you need to have a think about what do we need to do. And clearly, if there is to be modification, we're going to have to go back through thinking about that conformity issue again. But as I read it, as we read it, we don't seem to be conform with that aspect of the policy. We seem to be doing absolutely the entirely opposite thing, which doesn't seem quite right somewhere.
I think we've heard the arguments about the restrictive approach generally in the plan, so we're fully aware of that. And can appreciate generally where that would arise from in terms of this type of development. But you may you may wish to consider a modification that retains some of that restriction, but also takes into account that sort of clear, the clear policy there in the London plan. So, you know, it might be a nuance in terms of development would only be allowed if it conforms with the relevant policies of the London plan. I mean, it's for you to think about, but in those sorts of terms. I see Mr. Potter's got his hand up. If you want to come in, please, Mr. Potter.
Yes, just really as an observation, sort of independent of our representation, is that you seem to have this discussion sort of seems to have hit on something of, you might say, a blind spot in the plan making authorities approach, that they're seeing things in a very kind of, you might say, traditional waste management view. So it touches on something that, again, I referred to yesterday about the idea of maybe having a more local kind of waste biomass based boiler supplying you know, a district heating scheme in a housing situation. That wouldn't even necessarily be on the industrial land, which is the seems to be the primary concern that the boroughs are raising around the competition between, you know, waste and other uses for that site, that type of land. So yeah, it just really as a observation point of view, whether it's that type of thing, whether it's a small reuse facility, you know, all those things, it just does seem that the policies as written are very much a kind of put up a drawbridge and nothing else. And we know that yes, the idea of maybe, let's say, intensification on existing sites is fine, but if an operator can't get the agreement of the current sort of occupant of that site, then, you know, that's not going to happen. So really kind of supporting your requests for the boroughs to maybe look at that in a slightly sort of broader way and with a more forward-looking approach.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Potter. Any responses, Mr. James, to those points?
Not really. I think we accept that we need to have a look at our restrictions and consider how we can move forward with the, you know, considering how some flexibility could be introduced to those issues we've discussed this morning, as well as yesterday, with regards to WP3. So I think that's something for us to discuss, and we appreciate that we need to decide how to proceed on that.
Just to do a sense check as well, I think where we've referred in the plan to the environment strategy, we might be beneficial just to have a little check on that, and just to see whether or not there are any other tensions in the environment strategy with the London plan, and whether or not actually we ought to replace the environment strategy with the London plan as being the relevant planning document. But that's one big area that's been highlighted. Obviously, there is a conflict there, but there may be that none of us have picked up because we've not looked at not picked out another tension somewhere else. But where you've got reference to the environment strategy, it might be just worth having a little check just to make sure it's not going to take us down a line that's contrary to what's in the London plan. I'm not suggesting there is, but I think it's worth just doing that sense check while we're on this particular topic.
Yes, we'll check that, sir. No, that's no problem.
Okay, moving on to compensatory provision. Just a general question on that. So is it clear from the plan what evidence will be required to demonstrate that compensatory capacity is available, and will further modifications be necessary to achieve that? So that at a planning application stage, what would an applicant have to do to show that there is some compensatory capacity?
I was just referring back to the statement. Was that a question within the statements or just a supplementary? And I was just checking my notes.
It was a supplementary
Just-
one.
okay.
I think in terms of things that have been put in other people's statements. And I mean,
Well, I'm with you.
if it's something you need to reflect on, I'd be quite happy to take a view on it this afternoon.
Just to be clear, so how they demonstrate the compensatory capacity. So if I understand this correctly, I'd point you to the WP5, the schedule in which and this is typical what we're doing at the moment with the adopted waste plan also. We require the submission as part of the application, the types. So I would draw your attention to 1, 2, and 3 of that schedule at the end of WP5, where we seek the submission of the information that's available at that point in time. And from that, it's fairly clear what the existing capacity is and what all the relevant capacities that need to be compensated for or supplied.
Okay, so if an applicant wanted to change the use of the site from a waste use to a non-waste use, do they have to have, say, an extant planning permission on another site for waste before they can move? What's the threshold of the evidence there? Is it a theoretical, or there's intensification capacity on this other site that could come forward at some point? Or, what level of evidence would they need to provide?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good example that the current scheme with Suez, and I can think of one other smaller scheme where we would the planning obligation would seek that the site is operational. So before you have the loss on the one side, that if you, and you'd have to obviously you'd have to meet the tests of the planning obligation of the section 106. So and if it's in their powers, so it's ownership. And then as is in the case in Benedict Wharf, the Benedict Wharf site and the S12 site, the Sutton site, the planning obligation would ensure that once the new site is operational, then the other site can be released. So there would be, within the South London Waste Plan, there would be no capacity loss. Or if that was intensification on the existing site, we would seek similar reasonable planning conditions or whichever is the appropriate mechanism, planning obligation.
So would it be clear to an applicant or a decision taker what the mechanism might be from the plan? I don't need a quick answer now, but just in terms of, if someone were come to it fresh, or a planning application came in to change a waste site to a non-waste use, how would the decision taker think, well, they need to demonstrate this compensatory capacity available? Is there clarity there?
I'll venture a quick answer. In reality, in the South London Waste Plan, I've been working on from the adopted version till now, there are not many waste applications coming through, very few a year. And some boroughs have even less than others. So when they do come through, there's almost always, I would say, pretty much always a pre-app, because it's such a relatively rare that the realistic on the ground, what happens is the development management team immediately, because it's a unique, relatively unique scheme, will, and in that pre-app process, all these details will be clarified.
And remind me that there's a modification, isn't there, that refers specifically to pre-application discussions?
Yes, there's a modification to the schedule in WP5, which is reference number MM main modification 1.18, inserts and should therefore be considered as part of any pre-application engagement. So it clarifies and I think we'll probably discuss this later this afternoon, it clarifies the status of the schedule attached to WP5.
Okay, Mr. Potter, I can see your hands up if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, sir. Yes, notwithstanding the council's stated commitment earlier this morning around withdrawing our client's site from the plan, obviously we still have the current situation. So it does seem to me that it's a very good question asking, well, what the real mechanism is, because when an applicant is looking to frame their application, or when, for example, ourselves, as we do for operators, put together planning applications, you're looking at the extant plan to see which policies help and what mechanisms and guidance is given. It seems at the moment, I mean, the examples given by the boroughs just then in response to your question seem to relate more to a situation where you have a existing operator who has one site they wish to vacate, but then another site that they wish to or intend to open. It doesn't cover the scenario, for example, related to our client, where we have an operator who's actually seeking to withdraw from the sector, at least within South London, and then we are kind of left with a fairly large question mark over how that compensatory provision does need to be demonstrated. Examples that we've pursued would be seeking assurances or letters of assurance from other operators in the plan area to confirm that they have capacity. Now that that capacity may not actually be subject to a planning application either, but as I say, I think it is a question that requires a bit more in-depth thought to ensure that the process is clear for a release of appropriate sites, particularly in this situation where the boroughs are very keen to minimise the amount of land that's safeguarded, so they can maximise the land that's available for non-waste users. And in that regard, it would be helpful to also know, in connection with the modification of the objectives that are clearly stating their commitment to not safeguard anything more than necessary, how the policies that are currently set out would actually work together to assure that.
Thank you, Mr. Potter. So, Mr. James, in terms of those points, is there anything further you want to add at this juncture?
I don't think we've got anything further to add at this point, sir. I think there was an indication for us to have a look at the compensatory provision and what would be required to maybe see if there's any additional clarity we could introduce for applicants.
I think if it's perhaps helpful, Mr. James, I think the kind of tension that I see is that I can understand the criteria for compensated capacity. What I can't see is what has to be in place before you will consider alternative use on the site. So in other words, alternative uses could come forward. There's a criteria for compensatory capacity, but the link to say what has to happen to allow that first application to be progressed doesn't seem to be there. So I'm not arguing with the criteria about compensatory capacity. I'm not arguing with the approach. What I'm perhaps saying is I'm missing the link of being clear about, well, what aspect of that has got to be securely delivered. I know you've explained it verbally, but nonetheless, verbal is not in the plan. So what has to happen and be in place before you would consider alternative uses? You've set the framework as to how you get there in terms of what that site needs to do, but it's just that link about it has to be capable of being implemented, permission granted, or 106s, dots, everything else that needs to be in place. Probably some evidence that it actually is going to be used for that purpose. And it's that, I think, that notwithstanding what Inspector Fort might have said as well, other things, but it's that I'm missing to understand, well, how would you apply that then? I just can't see that link.
Yeah, understood, sir. We can take those points away. I think I can see what you're saying, so that's clear.
Mr. Potter.
And if I might also take this opportunity to we're talking about clarity around this, again, notwithstanding the borough's commitment to reviewing and omitting our client's site. It does seem to me that looking, for example, at the wording of WP3 as proposed, given that there could be sites which, like, for example, our clients, where there is a relatively small operation, waste-related operation taking place on a larger site, it seemed to us that it might be more appropriate for the wording of that in relation to safeguarding to relate more to the actual capacity assessed, let's say in the South London Waste Plan annual monitoring report, rather than the overall waste use. So you're looking at, okay, rather than this whole swathe of land that may have a relatively small operation on, what you're interested in here is actually protecting that capacity that you've identified, as contributing towards meeting the plan's objectives. So again, it's a sort of suggestion around maybe the change of wording to focus on capacity rather than the whole site itself. Thank you.
Okay, any initial responses to that, Mr. James, that point of safeguarding the capacity rather than the actual land take?
I see what Mr. Poulter's saying. I think we'd have to give some more thought about any potential repercussions of that change, because then there could be a knock-on effect. I'd like to think through what the impact of that might be before we would commit to that. But it's certainly something, we've got to look at WP3 and we've got to look at that clause. We know that, so that we can think about that as part of that discussion. I think because it's clear we are going to want to put forward some modifications to Part C, and so we can consider it as part of that. But I understand the point that he's making.
Okay, that concludes the questions that we have on this matter. So is there anything else, any points anybody wants to raise before we wrap up on this? Okay, Mr. James.
There was, so just going back to the morning session discussion we had about the Chesington railhead. We did have a discussion in the break, and a colleague from Kingston, I think we accept the arguments that were made, and that we could, we would find it acceptable to put forward a modification to safeguard that site. I just wanted to make that point now because I'm not sure if Ms. Walsh is going to be here for the afternoon session.
Thank you, Mr. James. Anything further to add as well?
Thank you, officers. Very welcome and appreciated. I'm not due to be here for the afternoon session, but happy to have a quick discussion at lunchtime. That's acceptable. Thank you.
Okay, given the amount of discussion we've had this morning, Inspector Normanton and I just thought it might be useful just to perhaps go through the potential modifications and things we've discussed thus far. So if you've been keeping a running log of those, if we could just quickly go through those, please.
Thanks, Inspector. I'll run through these. First is around the 777 sites and the modification associated with removing that, because we accept, there's a general acceptance that the capacity is declining. And there's consensus on the evidence there. The next is actually about the Chesington railheads, and my colleague Mr. James has just clarified that we're willing to consider safeguarding that. The third is considering flexibility to ensure that the objectives on the circular economy are met and not stifled. The fourth is considering the conformity issues on energy from waste arising from the Mayor's London plan, and also considering the Mayor's environment strategy at the same time. And the fifth is understanding about the compensatory capacity, so that applicants are clear what they need to provide to ensure that compensatory capacity is met. Those are the five that we have.
The only other one I picked up was Mr. Witter's point on the monitoring table in terms of how intensification of sites could be monitored. That's the only other one I had.
And I know Mr. Potter wants to come in, but there was a last point that Mr. Potter raised about you having to think about, and that's without prejudice to the outcome, about whether it's capacity that needs to be considered. So not lose sight of that in terms of at least thought about it. I do apologise. It's kind of something we would agree to look at rather than being firm about what the outcome might be on that one.
Yeah, sorry, I've just picked up another one, and that was Inspector Normanton's suggestion that there should be a sense check on the environment strategy throughout the plan, just to see how that actually squares with the adopted London plan.
Just to clarify, so I think on the third one, Ms. Butler mentioned about the circular economy. This one's looking at the wider issue about the restrictions we've got and the degree to which we could consider introducing some flexibility for those exceptional cases. So that would be, I think, covered in the third point that was mentioned there.
Okay, so thank you all. That concludes our discussion on matter 3, and thank you all for your contributions this morning.